For Thaddius Crow, silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a presence. For 15 years, it had been his most steadfast companion. A fortress built of grief to keep the world out. The only conversations he had were with the wind and with memory. And he was always the only one listening. But that afternoon, under a sun that beat down with the indifference of a blacksmith's hammer, something broke his pact with the quiet. It was a sound so foreign it was almost unrecognizable. Human voices. Thaddius let the hammer fall. He squinted toward the dirt track leading to his ranch, a blurry ribbon of dust in the heat. They were heat shimmer apparitions at first, wavering, unreal shapes. But then they resolved into focus. 3 women. He hadn't had a visitor since he'd buried his family. He'd built this life, fence post by fence post, to ensure no one could get close again. And now the world was walking right up his drive. They moved with the exhausted slowness of people who had traveled too far, with nowhere left to go. Small children clung to their mothers' skirts, little faces smudged with dust and tears. An old, unwelcome feeling stirred in Thaddius's chest. He knew what strangers brought: need, trouble, and questions that picked at scars he thought had healed. His hand instinctively found the cold, familiar comfort of the Winchester rifle leaning against the post. It wasn't a threat, so much as a habit, a reflex honed over 1,000 solitary days. As they drew closer, their desperation became as plain as the daylight. Their dresses were ghosts of former colors, now just a dusty gray. The woman in the lead, dark hair escaping a faded bonnet, had a purpose in her stride, even as her shoulders sagged with exhaustion. They stopped about 20 yards from his fence. 20 yards of sun-baked earth, separating his world from theirs. Thaddius stood motionless, a man who looked as if he were carved from the unforgiving land itself. He could see the grime on their clothes, the weariness in their eyes, and the way the children hid behind their mothers, seeking shelter from the silent, strange man. He had done everything in his power to avoid moments like this, to never again carry the weight of another's problems. But as he looked into the eyes of the smallest child, wide, innocent, and afraid, he saw ghosts of his own. He saw faces he had tried to forget. And he knew that some choices are not made by us. They make themselves. With a groan of hinges that sounded like a final surrender, Thaddius Crow opened the gate to his life. And as he gestured them inside, he knew he wasn't just letting in 3 strangers. He was letting the past, the present, and whatever dangerous future they carried, walk right across his threshold. The air inside the house was still and cool, heavy with the dust of dormant years. It was a place where time had not so much passed as stopped. Light struggled through grimy window panes, illuminating dancing dust motes in the silent parlor. There was one chair, and a long wooden bench he'd built but never used. It was a room meant for living, that had long forgotten how. The women entered as if stepping into a church, their children clinging close. Thaddius leaned against the doorframe. To sit felt too much like an acceptance of this new reality. The words came haltingly at first, from the woman named Clarabelle. She spoke of a boarding house 20 miles east, and of its owner, a man whose hospitality had a price not measured in coin. Thaddius listened, his jaw tightening. He knew the type. Men who saw desperation not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Men who preyed on those with nowhere left to turn. "So you left," he said, his voice a rough sound from disuse. "We had 2, another woman, Mercy, added." Her voice was tight with a cold fury. Then the 3rd woman, Violet, spoke next, her voice barely a whisper. "A lady in town. She told us to find this place." She hesitated, then met his gaze. "She said a man named Thaddius Crow lived here." The name. His name, spoken aloud in this silent house, was a shock. But her next words, they were a violation, a trespass on sacred ground. She said, you had lost your own, and that you would understand what it means to have to protect your children. The room fell deadly quiet. The carefully constructed walls around Thaddius's heart began to crack. Memories he kept buried under 15 years of dust and silence clawed their way to the surface. Sarah's laugh. Little Emma. Chasing grasshoppers in the yard outside. The fever that took them both while he was away. He turned from them, staring out the window at the vast, empty land he had chosen as his penance. His solitude was meant to ensure he would never fail to protect someone he loved again. And now these strangers, with the ghost of his own tragedy on their lips, were asking him to risk that failure once more. The youngest girl had wandered to a dusty shelf, where a small, forgotten wooden horse sat. Emma's horse. Carved for a 4th birthday that was her last. The child reached for it with small, tentative fingers, then looked up at him. Her eyes, full of a heartbreakingly familiar innocence, asked a silent question. Before he could answer, another sound cut through the stillness. Not a human voice this time, but the hard, urgent drumming of hoofbeats on the road outside. Getting closer. He knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the trouble they were running from had just found them. Get the children to the back room, Thaddius said, his voice quiet, yet carrying an authority that cut through their fear. Stay there, and stay silent. The women moved without a word. Through the window, he watched 2 men dismount by his gate. The first was a stranger, lean and predatory, with eyes that seemed to calculate profit and human misery in the same cold glance. But it was the second man who made Thaddius's blood run cold. Older, thicker around the middle, with a sheriff's badge pinned to his chest that caught the dying afternoon light. Sheriff Marcus Cale. The same lawman who'd stood in this very room 15 years ago, explaining why the death of a poor man's family wasn't worth investigating. The same man who let justice be sold to the highest bidder. Thaddius grabbed his Winchester from beside the door and stepped onto the porch. He didn't raise it, but its presence in his hands was a statement clear enough. This was his land. Thaddius Crow, Sheriff Cale called out, his voice thick with a false friendliness. Been a long time. Not long enough, Thaddius said, his tone flat as the plains. State your business. The lean man, Garrett, stepped forward. I'm looking for 3 women. They ran off with something that belongs to me. We tracked them this far. Haven't seen anyone, Thaddius lied, his voice a low wall of sound. Garrett smiled, a cold, thin expression. That's funny. 'Cause their tracks lead right to your gate. From inside the house, a floorboard creaked. A child's whimper, quickly hushed, was as loud as a gunshot in the tense silence. Sheriff Cale's smile widened. Sounds like you've got company, Thaddius. Mind if we come in and say hello? I mind plenty. Now, the sheriff said, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. We're just looking for some missing property. 3 women who owe Mr. Garrett here. Just a friendly conversation is all? Property. The word struck Thaddius with the force of a physical blow. They spoke of these mothers as if they were livestock. The same casual dismissal he'd faced when his own wife and daughter were dying. Just a problem to be ignored. The only conversation I'm interested in, Thaddius said, raising the rifle just an inch, is the one where you 2 get back on your horses and leave. Garrett's mask of civility slipped, revealing the raw violence beneath. Those women belong to me. I'm not leaving without them. The hell you're not. The 2 men exchanged a look, calculating the odds. 2 guns against 1. But Thaddius had the high ground, the cover of his home, and something more. A reason to fight that ran deeper than greed. He knew that 15 years of hiding from the world had not been a retreat. It had been a long, slow burn, waiting for a spark. And with 3 mothers and their children depending on him, Thaddius Crow was about to discover exactly what kind of man he still was. Garrett's hand blurred toward his gun. But 15 years of solitude had not dulled the instincts of a man who knew survival. Thaddeus's rifle was already at his shoulder. It barked once, the sound shattering the afternoon quiet. Splinters flew from the fence post, inches from the stranger's head, sending him diving for the cover of his horse. Sheriff Cale drew his own weapon but hesitated, his face a mask of disbelief. He remembered a broken man. Not this. The next one won't be a warning, Thaddius called out, his voice steady as he worked the bolt on the Winchester. Get off my land. From inside the house, a child's cry rose in terror, quickly muffled by a mother's hand. Each sob was a knife in Thaddeus's chest, a ghost of another child's cry he had been powerless to stop. But not this time. This time, he could do something. You're making a grave mistake, Crow, Sheriff Cale shouted, using his own horse as a shield. Those women are fugitives. Harboring them makes you one, too. Then arrest me, Thaddius replied, the challenge hanging in the hot, still air. Come on up here and put me in chains. I'm waiting. Cale had the law on his side, but the law meant nothing when you were staring down the barrel of a rifle, held by a man who had already lost everything that mattered. Garrett peeked out from behind his horse, his pistol now in hand. There's $50 in it for you, Crow. For each of them. Just walk away. Counteroffer, Thaddius said, his voice dropping low. You ride out of here now, and I don't put a hole in you. It was then that the front door opened behind him. Clarabelle stepped onto the porch. Her hands were held out where they could be seen, her chin raised in defiance. Thaddius felt a surge of panic. Get back inside. But she shook her head, her eyes fixed on the men in the yard. No, she said, her voice clear and strong. No more running. No more hiding. She looked down at Thaddius, and in her eyes, he saw a courage that shamed his own long years of retreat. Mr. Garrett, she called out, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. You want to talk to us? Then talk. But you will leave this man out of it. Clarabelle's defiance hung in the air, a challenge that left both Garrett and the sheriff momentarily speechless. Behind her, the door opened again. Mercy emerged, her young son Samuel at her side. Then came Violet, clutching her small bundle. They did not huddle in fear. They stood shoulder to shoulder with Clarabelle, a silent wall of maternal courage. Garrett's ugly laugh broke the silence. The boy doesn't understand how the world works. Debts get paid. It was then that young Samuel stepped forward, his small frame trembling but his voice clear. My mom's not for sale. The simple truth of it, from the mouth of a child, seemed to strike Sheriff Cale. For a brief second, something flickered in the lawman's eyes, not conscience, perhaps, but the dim recognition of a line he was about to cross. That's when they heard it. Another sound on the wind. The steady, growing rhythm of more horses, moving fast up the main road. A grin spread across Garrett's face, thinking reinforcements had arrived. But as the riders crested the hill, Thaddius saw they were not Garrett's men. They were something far more dangerous to him. Witnesses. 5 men, led by a grizzled rancher Thaddius recognized from town. Wade McKinley. A man whose word was worth more than gold in this territory, and whose eyes missed nothing. McKinley took in the scene, the armed men in the yard, Thaddius on the porch with his rifle, The 3 defiant women and their children? Sheriff, McKinley said, his voice calm but heavy as granite. What kind of official business brings you out to Thaddius Crow's place? Cale's confidence faltered. These women are fugitives, Wade. It's a legal matter. Funny, McKinley replied, his gaze shifting to Garrett. They look like mothers protecting their children to me. The world had suddenly grown much larger than Thaddeus's front yard. But before another word could be spoken, Garrett lunged forward. His arm snaked out and he grabbed the boy, Samuel, pulling him close and pressing the cold steel of his pistol to the child's head. Enough talk. Garrett snarled. The women come with me now, or the boy pays the price. The world went deadly silent. Mercy started forward with a choked cry, but froze. Clarabelle stepped forward, her hands raised in surrender. Take me, she pleaded. Let the children go, and I'll go with you. All 3 of you, Garrett replied coldly, or the boy dies. Thaddeus felt something inside him break. He watched as 3 mothers prepared to walk back into hell to save their children. He raised his rifle, ready to trade his life for theirs. The shot echoed across the ranch like thunder. But it wasn't Thaddeus who fired. Wade McKinley's rifle smoked in his hands. Garrett crumpled to the ground, clutching a bloody shoulder, his weapon spinning away in the dirt. The boy, stunned but unharmed, scrambled back to his mother's arms. Sheriff Cale stood frozen, his hand on his gun, now facing 5 armed and angry ranchers. Threatening children, McKinley said, his voice as cold and hard as a winter river that crosses every line there is. Sheriff Cale looked at the faces staring back at him. At McKinley's men, their hands resting on their rifles. At the 3 women on the porch, their fear replaced by a quiet strength. And at Thaddius Crow, a man who had become a rock against which the storm had broken. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and on the wrong side of justice. Here's what's going to happen, McKinley announced, his voice leaving no room for argument. You're going to get your wounded friend there, load him on his horse, and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on the sheriff. And you're going to forget you ever heard of this place. Or I'll make sure every decent person in this territory knows exactly what kind of law you've been enforcing. Without another word, Cale holstered his weapon and hauled the groaning Garrett to his feet. As they rode away, Garrett slumped over his saddle, their dignity trailing behind them in the dust. An extraordinary silence settled over the ranch. Not the empty silence of loneliness, but the peaceful quiet of safety restored. The little girl, who had been clutching Emma's wooden horse through the entire ordeal, held it up to Thaddeus. Her eyes asked the question her lips could not form. Thaddeus felt his throat tighten. He knelt down, his gaze softening. It belongs here, he said softly. Just like you do. If you want to stay. The 3 women exchanged a look, hope and disbelief warring in their expressions. You mean that? Mercy asked. This ranch has been empty too long, Thaddeus replied, his voice rough with emotion. It could use the sound of children playing again. McKinley clapped him on the shoulder. Good man, Thaddeus. You're Sarah and Emma. They'd be proud. As McKinley and his men rode away, Thaddeus stood in his yard, watching 3 children chase each other around the fence posts while their mothers talked quietly on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the entire world in warm gold, and for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't dreading the approach of night. Clarabelle walked over to him, her daughter still clutching the wooden horse. Thank you, she said simply. For everything. Thank you, he replied, his eyes on the children. For reminding me that some things are worth fighting for. That evening, as lamplight spilled from windows that had been dark for too long, And as children's laughter echoed through rooms that had forgotten the sound of joy, Thaddius Crow realized that the greatest courage isn't found in facing your fears alone. Sometimes, it's found in letting others stand beside you. In choosing to protect rather than withdraw. In opening your heart, even when you're afraid it might break again. He discovered that the man he thought he'd buried with his family had never really died. He'd just been waiting for a reason to live again.